Greetings, brethren, and welcome to this Annual Sabbath Day for the 24th day of May 2015. On the sacred holy calendar, on the Hebrew calendar, it is the 6th day of Sivan today. Now, Pentecost is a day we have to count from the weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. And I'll be commenting on that in just a little bit of detail today before we go to Mr. Armstrong with a special service. But I want to say happy Sabbath to all of you. This is a very special Sabbath day today, an annual Sabbath day, the day of Pentecost. As I mentioned, we count it from the days of unleavened bread, from the regular weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. Now, that weekly Sabbath can be a feast day, or it can be a holy day. Now, I paused on that because, Passover is not a holy day. Passover is the most significant of the feast days. It's the most solemn of the feast days of the whole year. And yet, Passover is not an annual holy day. It is, in Leviticus 23, listed as a feast day. And it's not a day of a holy convocation day, and yet we often have met together on the evening before Passover to keep Passover together at headquarters for a long time until we became scattered. Now a lot of people do it in their homes, watch it with us on COG TV, or have the head of household lead it right in your own home. Either way is fine to do that. But the regular weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread can be the Passover, or it can be, when the Passover is on a Friday, it can be the first day of unleavened bread. It can never be the last day of unleavened bread. Oops, just lost some of you. Hey, we're getting out of here. Okay, now listen, you need to understand, those of you that stay with it and want to know the truth, the reason it cannot be the last day of unleavened bread is because the wave sheaf day has to occur during the days of unleavened bread. And if your weekly Sabbath during unleavened bread falls on the last day of unleavened bread, then that would cause, if you consider the wave sheaf day to be from that, the last day of unleavened bread, you'd have the wave sheaf day outside of the days of unleavened bread. Now, I didn't get to mean to be too heavy and technical on a day that's supposed to be a day of great rejoicing, the day that God poured out His Holy Spirit on the New Testament church. And you'll hear some details about that from Mr. Armstrong, just how spectacular and special that makes this day be. But I'm covering that because there's some people saying, oh, this is, from year to year, they'll say this is the wrong day. If Passover falls on a regular weekly Sabbath, then some people wind up counting Pentecost incorrectly and being a whole week off because of that. And there are some details that God gives us that makes all this work out. But first of all, let me cover a few things. Yesterday, we gave some scriptures to some of those who lost a loved one this week, and that I intended to be encouraging, and I wanted also people to be understanding, and even yourself to be understanding if this has happened to you, such as has happened to Susan and Teresa and Wanda of Ohio. I don't believe they'll mind my mentioning their full names, as I did yesterday on the weekly Sabbath. Susan Yvonne Grubb Hill, Teresa Ireland, and Wanda Jordan. And they lost their dad, Mr. Grubb, earlier this week from London. And our condolences go out to them. I mentioned yesterday how I remember so much when my dad died, how shocked I was it happened so close to, and in fact on, a feast day. And yet God helped me go through it, helped me do the mourning that is actually good to do. Because you love a person who's close to you, you're going to miss them deeply and in a very, 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 very special way. And there's some understanding the rest of us should have. When we're around someone that may have just lost a loved one a few days ago, they may not be in a mood to want to sing, or do zingy things. They may want to stay calm, thoughtful, and it's good if we can be considerate of that. And even though it's a day to rejoice, normally, this is not a normal time in every person's life when events like that happen. And so they may be present while the rest of you sing and just hold the book and not move their lips because when you're mourning, the voice is just not going to sound the same. You're not going to be able to hit the notes because oftentimes you can be in intense emotional feelings when you've just lost a very close loved one, such as a parent would be, and you're just not in a mood to sing. And there's a scripture that has something to say on this. It's in James 5, verse 13. It says, "Is any among you afflicted?" That means in a hard trial, enduring pain of some kind, such as the pain of losing a loved one, the sting of death, a time of mourning would be. And it says, in that case, let him pray. Contrawise, on the other hand, in a totally different situation, is any merry among you? Well, let him sing psalms. And so God recognizes there are times when we may be in a different mood. In fact, he covers that in some detail in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And I'm just going to zero in on verse 4. It starts in verse 1, goes through about verse 7 or 8, continues the whole theme and mentions all kind of contrast. If there's a time for this, a time for that, and all the this and the that's are very different. They contrast one another, but the ones that relate to what I'm saying the most is found in verse 4, where God there says, there's a time to weep. There is a time to weep. And right after you've lost a loved one, that would indeed be that kind of time, a time for weeping, a time for mourning, not a time to laugh or to dance, as this verse 4 of Ecclesiastes 4 says. And it is good to mourn the loss of someone close to you. Now, I do have friends who have said when they die, they don't want everybody standing around crying over them. They've even said, look, if you're present and have anything to do with my funeral, I want you to go out and buy beer and serve it to everyone and have everybody sing When the Saints Go Marching In. and I know a family in Texas where the father, the husband, the man of the house told the rest of them, his wife and his daughter, when I die, y'all go out and buy ice cream and eat it, and celebrate because, hey, I no longer have to suffer in this physical life with the rest of you. I'm looking forward to the resurrection, and it's you guys that have to suffer in this physical life a little longer. Not me. I am counted. My physical life is done. Those, I'm talking about those in your family who've been called to the first resurrection. And at their next moment of life, they'll come up spirit and with great joy, having shed this flesh that can have problems. I've got a sore on my finger where feeding my horse the other day. I hope my finger's back, so he didn't get my finger in his mouth, thankfully. But still, he was mad. The horse was angry because, he thought he should be able to eat the donkey's food too, and I was making him stay away from the donkey. He was mad at me, so when I gave him a cube, an alfalfa cube, he bit my finger. Maybe he didn't mean to, but he was just angry, and he wasn't using that careful self-control with my hand the way he usually would when I feed him. I keep my fingers back. Some of you saying, oh, you didn't keep your fingers back. Yes, I did. But he still managed to get his teeth on my skin. Ouch! Of that finger. It still hurts. And so we won't have these aches and pains of this flesh in the spiritual life. Somebody can bite us. Have at it. It doesn't hurt me once we're transformed. Okay. I hope I made that point well. And those of you who are in a situation where, for you, it's a time of some weeping, some mourning. When I mourned for my dad, I let out a howl that probably at first scared my brother. It put a shocked look on his face, and then we're going back 7 years now to the day my dad died. And my brother's standing next to me when I began loud howling next to my dad, who had just died seconds before. When the nurse announced his spirit passed, he died now. And my brother began howling with me, and by howling, I mean just loud mourning, let out a big wail. And my brother, who loved my dad very much too, began wailing with me. When I think of that, you can still choke up. And I'm thinking about those who've lost their dad, and I hope the rest of you who know them will, give them the space they need to do something that is normal to do, to mourn, or if they want it, but they may not want to always just be alone and by themselves. It's good to be around them, but go more into a listening mode than a talking mode, because they may want to make some expressions of things they enjoyed with their dad, their parent, and they just may want to share that. They may be moving into a positive, joyful state, remembering good things and looking forward to God's kingdom. I did put a scripture on the screen yesterday that says, reminds us that we don't, I forgot the exact word, where the scripture is even, but I put it up yesterday. It says we don't exactly mourn in the same way. We do mourn, and we should, but not in the same way the world does, who have no hope, who don't really know and understand what God is doing. They've been taught something about going off to heaven or hell if they don't make heaven. And it don't make a whole lot of good sense, and a lot of people don't fully believe it. They go along with it and pretend they do, and they're really wondering what happened to this loved one. Did he go make it to heaven, or did he go down to hell? And they have no hope. They don't understand the truth. And those of us who understand the resurrection and know that person is sleeping, we're just missing them. That's it. We know we're going to see them again. So even though that feeling of loss can be great and have powerful emotional impact, especially if you were close to someone who kept you encouraged and now they're not there, or they did things for you that now they're not there to do for you, it can have tremendous impact on you. So there is a time for that. But today is a time to rejoice. And even though my dad died on Pentecost, I was able to put off my mourning for the rest of the day and fellowship with brethren and listen to services. And, of course, then immediately following that, I did go into not just 30 days of mourning, but kind of a long mourning for my dad. But, brethren, let me tell you what I was doing this morning, and I have to apologize for being late today. For those of you who normally would watch the live stream, I usually get it on time on the Sabbath. Today I missed the mark. I was kind of semi-ready to go about 3 hours ago, and then I decided to go into a study that caused me to lose track of the clock until I looked up, 20 minutes late. And still wanting to do more studying and just had to stop it. But I'm going to share a little bit of that with you because there's a lady who just died. I'll show you her picture later. Her name is Mrs. Lorinda LeBleu. And she was born back in 1913. She was 102 years old when she died this last week. She attended the feast from the time Mr. Armstrong opened that up to a local congregation in Oregon back in he and his wife kept them between 1927 and 1936, 7 years. Let's see if they kept 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33 by themselves. In 1934, when they opened them up to the local area, and they had 19 members keeping the feast with Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong from 1934, on, there are some. Let me just give a positive note here. Mrs. LeBleu has a diary going back to at least 1935 that shows she keeping the feast with Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong, keeping Pentecost, not on a Monday then. Mr. Armstrong did not keep Pentecost on Monday, counting it to a Monday from the beginning. Her diary shows that they were keeping Pentecost on Sivan, or Sivan, however you say that. They were keeping it on the third month on God's sacred calendar, on the 6th day of the third month, Sivan 6, in the early years, because Mr. Armstrong, from 1927 to whenever he changed it in either 1937 or 1939 to doing on Monday, had been following the rabbinical priesthood. Now, why am I telling you that today, brother? You say, well, look, we know Mr. Armstrong kept it on Monday for X number of years, more than 3 decades, and in 1974, God showed him, revealed to him that he was counting it wrong, that we should be counting it to the morrow after the 7th literal Sabbath day during, following the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it comes out to be on the first day of the week, because the morrow after a Sabbath is the first day of the week, a Sunday. And Mr. Armstrong was made to understand that when God opened his mind to show him, hey, look, I allowed you to be doing this wrong for a number of years, and now here's a test. And this test goes along with something Mr. Armstrong said way back in the beginning of his ministry about the test of a true church. He said this back in 1927. I'll show it to you from the autobiography in just a moment. I think you'll find that interesting because it helps. He said this is one of the proofs of God's true church as he was evaluating the Sardis era church, which started to be no longer to be God's church, to become a dead church because they refused to grow in truth. And when God would reveal something to them, they said, "Oh no, a lot of we'll lose our members and a lot of our tithes, so we're not going to tell them that." And they died. And then God opened up the door for the Philadelphia era to spring forth that he built up through Mr. Armstrong. And Mr. Armstrong gave him to the day he died. Mr. Armstrong gave God the credit for doing the work through him and acknowledging that he was an instrument, a fine instrument, by the way, one God mightily and well played, because Mr. Armstrong was, as he put it himself, 99.8 or 9% submissive to God. You know, Mr. Armstrong admitted he might be 1 or 2/10% unsubmissive, but overall he humbled himself and was submissive to God. And he may have been using a little humor for our sake, saying that, look, in the flesh we can goof up, you know, but we shouldn't be goofing up in a major way. Our goof up should be minor, occasional stumbles that we say, God, I am really, truly sorry, and I repent, and I'm going to look at how and why I stumbled in this regard, and I'm going to patch the holes so that I don't fall through them in the future, you know, and be on and whatever it is. If you're not on your knees enough, asking him for help in his spirit and praying enough, well, patch the hole, get on your knees more. You know, put some knee pads on if you have to, and do more knee time. You know, whatever it is, brethren, we do need to be overcoming and obeying. If you don't agree with that, well then, hey, there's a lot of other places you can be other than watching this video and trying to point your finger at me of how wretched I am. And I'll be the first to admit it. Look, I am in this flesh. This flesh gets, as it gets older, it fades. And thankfully, God's offering us a brand new body that won't grow old, that will be made of Spirit and something wonderful. And today represents a day of Him pouring out His Spirit. Now let me cover just a few pertinent points and explain to you as carefully as I can the reason I'm doing this. There are some people I would still love to see be helped to primarily operate out of Oregon, who and other places too. They've got congregations all over in many respects, and we wish it'd be, since we're all to speak the same thing and be of one mind and one spirit, that spirit is not divisive. It's not one that encourages some brethren to keep Pentecost on the first day of the week, that we call Sunday now under the Roman calendar system, and others to keep it on the second day of the week that we call Monday, Moon Day, under the Roman calendar system. You know, Monday's just an abbreviation for Moon Day, sun for Sunday, and some are keeping it on Moon Day, you know, out of a teaching that says, well, God revealed the truth to Mr. Armstrong originally, and we're not going to move away from revealed truth. Mr. Armstrong erred when he moved away from revealed knowledge. And they try to say and tell you and get you to believe that God revealed to Mr. Armstrong originally and initially that Pentecost should be kept on Monday. Not according to Mrs. LeBleu's diary, who kept those original feast days with Mr. Armstrong, beginning from when Mr. Armstrong opened it up to the local area in 1934. Her diary proves, showing the dates they were keeping Pentecost, that she was keeping it with Mr. Armstrong. She was keeping it with Mr. Armstrong as he did it then on Sivan 6, on the 6th day of the 3rd month of God's sacred calendar. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at Mr. Armstrong. I love Mr. Armstrong, and I defer to Mr. Armstrong, knowing how he submitted himself to God. If there's any question, I am going always to defer to Mr. Armstrong. Now, if there's something in the Bible that would contradict what Mr. Armstrong says, I'd lean toward the Bible. But to this point in time, and as Mr. Armstrong encouraged us to do, brethren, don't believe me because I said it. Believe it because what I tell you is coming from the Bible. You won't find anything Mr. Armstrong said in the latter days of his life, after God had corrected him over this or that. You won't find anything that's contrary to the Bible. I'll just lay my reputation on the line out on that. Now, yeah, for almost 40 years, or at one point we were saying 40 years, but I'm now looking at it and saying, well, that it may be minus a year or two of 40 years. I was praying hard in 1972, 1973, and 1974. God, please, either correct me for misunderstanding and thinking Pentecost should be on Sunday, or correct all of us through your leader, Mr. Herbert Armstrong. We didn't call him apostle then. I didn't think of him as apostle then, but I thought of him as the leader of God's Philadelphia-era true church, through whom God had worked as if he were working in the same manner and style that God worked through Moses as the human leader. And I asked God to please correct all of us through Mr. Armstrong. You know, from the top down, if what I was reading in Leviticus 23, verse 16, were correct as I was reading it, that Pentecost should be on the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, and the word there is Shabbat, which means Sabbath day. It doesn't mean Shabuah, week. There's a word for week. Even though 7 Sabbaths can also mean 7 weeks, 7 complete weeks from Sunday through the end of Sabbath. It does have that idiomatic meaning, but because there is a word for weeks, Shabuah, just as they taught us at Ambassador College in French class and in English grammar class. Transliteration or idiomatic expressions, when you're doing transliteration between one language and another, as you have to do between Hebrew and English for what God was saying in Hebrew, so we understand it in English. When you do transliteration, when there's a word for something and that word is used, then an idiomatic expression or an idiomatic understanding would not trump the way the wording was literally used. It wouldn't trump it. It wouldn't override it. However, that doesn't mean just when a literal idiomatic expression is used, it can also have an idiomatic understanding, but that idiomatic understanding will not override the actual literal expression. And the literal expression was the day after the seventh Sabbath day. So what I'm saying to you is, look, that period encompasses 7 full, complete weeks. So when we come to, as Acts 2 says, when the days of Pentecost are fully come, when they finally come, when all 7 weeks have completely played out, and then at the end of that 7th week begins the 50th day, so that we're on the day of Pentecost, on day number 50, those 7 weeks have completely run. The time has fully come now. It's finally arrived, is another way of saying has fully come. When you look up that funny-looking Greek word used in Acts 2 for fully come, I was doing it in an email earlier. It's kind of hard to pronounce and a funny word. But you look it up. It's in Strong's Greek Concordance, and you'll see the additional definitions. And nothing fuddy-duddy about fully come. It's archaic English language. Well, maybe you would say it's kind of fuddy-duddy. It's old archaic English language, but it's just, in simple understanding, it just simply means when the count the 7 weeks have fully passed, here we are, day 50 is here now today. It's fully come on us. That time we had to be counting. Pentecost is the only day we count. If it didn't need to be counted, if it were set on a certain day of the calendar every year, if it were always going to be Sivan 6, as it happened to fall Sivan 6 today, interestingly, on the day I'm giving this a little bit of a talk on it, but if it always fell on Sivan 6, we wouldn't need to count it. You just say, hey, Pentecost is Sivan 6 every year. And so for the first 7, 8, 9, 10 years, Mr. Armstrong kept Pentecost on Sivan 6 as the old rabbinical priesthood of the Jews do, even still today. But Mr. Armstrong learned, God revealed this much to him, little by little. You'll see a quote from the autobiography I'll put on the screen in just a moment, where Mr. Armstrong says, God revealed, he didn't give us truth all at once when we first come into the church. He gives it to us little by little. Now, those that come in after it's already there in printing and publishing everything, you could sit down and, in an unbalanced way, you could blob your head full of everything. You'd probably walk away like a blob, too. You wouldn't remember it all. We learn to remember these things God has us keep them every Sabbath. He has us keep the annual Sabbaths every year, the weekly Sabbaths every Sabbath, and by repeating that every week, we are refreshed in what we have learned, and we learn a little more, and God's happy having us learn it little by little. And then where we may not have learned something completely, when God sees that you're obeying, just as like in the same way He gives His Holy Spirit to those who obey, and then He gives you more as you obey more, like Acts 5, verse 29 or 32 says, He gives us more truth as He sees us applying it and using it and understanding it. Let me turn to Acts 5, tell you exactly which verse, the one that says He gives His Spirit to those who obey. I think it's 32. And we are His witnesses of these things, and so is also the Holy Spirit. King James, I know, says Holy Ghost, but that word really means Spirit, whom God has given to them that obey Him. So that is verse 32. Verse 29 talks about obeying God rather than men when there's a contradiction, when there's a conflict. But brethren, with Pentecost, we count it, and it comes out on a day after the 7th Sabbath, from the Sabbath that falls during the days of unleavened bread. Now, that Sabbath day is the triggering Sabbath. That's Sabbath 0. You have to have a full week before you count the first Sabbath. It's just like when you're born. You're born at age 0. You're not 1 year old until you've lived a whole year. The first Sabbath doesn't occur until 1 week after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. The Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread is Sabbath number 0. Hopefully that helps some of you, because I've studied this in some depth. But let me go through this. In 1936, that would be the third year that Mr. Armstrong is now meeting with other brethren. He and his wife Loma are no longer keeping the holy days alone by themselves, just the two of them, which they did between 1927 and 1933, 7 years by themselves. They had a campaign meeting. They now have 19 Philadelphia-era church members who are willing and who do keep the annual feast days with Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong, Mrs. Lorinda Lindy LeBleu being one of them. And as her diary indicates, in 1936 and in 1935, they were keeping Pentecost on Sivan 6. Now, some of you might say, well, look, we're keeping Pentecost today, this year, on Sivan 6. And we counted it from the Sabbath that fell during the days of unleavened bread, and it comes out 50. It could be, you might say, you might rightfully say as you first think about this, well, wait a second. I'm not going to buy into that Mr. Armstrong was keeping Pentecost every year on Sivan 6 under the rabbinical priesthood by one example of Pentecost having fallen on Sivan 6 in a year many years ago when Mr. Armstrong was keeping it. Okay, brother, I'm going to show you at least 2 years, and you can take it further than that if you want to. But I'm also going to show you this. I'm going to show you the fact that on the Sivan 6 that Mr. Armstrong and Loma Armstrong and Mrs. Lorinda Lindy LeBleu kept Pentecost in 1936, it was not 50 days after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, which fell on a different date. Let me show you this. Let me bring this slide forward. Can you see this? Okay, you can see at the top it says Sivan 6, the 6th of Sivan, in the year 1936 was on a Wednesday, May 27. Not on a Sunday, not on a Monday, but on Wednesday, May 27. Passover that year in 1936 was Monday, April the 6th. The following Sabbath would have been, let's just count it out together, if Monday was April 6th, Pentecost, we're talking about Pentecost Day, the Passover foot washing would have been Sunday night, April 5 that year. But Passover being April 6th, then you'd have Tuesday the 7th, Wednesday the 8th, Thursday the 9th, Friday the 10th, Sabbath the 11th, and then the 12th day of April would have been the wave sheaf day, the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. That had been April 12. That April 12 would be day 1 of the 50 days to Pentecost. The Sabbath before that would be the triggering Sabbath. It would be Sabbath 0. The following Sabbath outside the days of unleavened bread would be the first Sabbath, as you count 7, complete Sabbaths. And so when we finally get to Sabbath May 30, that's the 7th Sabbath since those days of unleavened bread, then the following day, the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, would be Sunday, May 31 of 1936, which on the Hebrew calendar that year was not Sivan 6, was not the 6th day of the third month, but the 10th day of the third month, the 10th day of Sivan. So it wasn't the 6th. It wasn't Sivan 6. It was Sivan 10 that year. So do you see what I'm saying? I'm telling you that Mr. Armstrong and Mrs. LeBleu and Loma Armstrong too, kept Passover in 1936, as Mrs. LeBleu's diary says, on Sivan 6. That would have been Wednesday, May 27, when the actual count from the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread would have put Pentecost on Sunday, May 31, and Sivan 10. So, we eliminated, just by looking up the actual Hebrew date there in 1936, of when Pentecost would have been, if you count it from the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, that would have come out to Sivan 10. But they kept Pentecost that year on Sivan 6. that's 1 year of several that show you that Mr. Armstrong, during his first years, was not keeping a Monday Pentecost. Shock! Woo! Wow! Some of you that are keeping Monday Pentecost based on a teaching that has been erroneously taught to you by some, I'm not going to mention names, some of you know the names well, like Raymond Cole. Oh, I just lied, didn't I? I just mentioned a name. Maybe I should apologize to some of his relatives. But listen, God says, mark those that do well and mark those that don't do well. And sad to say, as it is, the man did not do well in going against God's servant and apostle, Mr. Armstrong. In fact, he did an evil thing. And yet it may be possible, as some have, to yet turn from that. And God can forgive Mr. LeCole. Might even surprise some of you that if enough of his relatives who learn the truth and repent of it now, that could cause God to say, okay, I know Mr. Cole and I know we can overcome this. I'm going to bring him on up. And when he sees the rest of his family and we explain it to him that I know him, I'm not saying God is definitely going to do this. I'm just saying God could. And we don't know God's mind on this, and we don't know the inner workings of the other person's mind. So I'm not judging the man or condemning him eternally. I'm saying that what he did wasn't evil, that has caused a lot of people to stumble up. And that's a factor God is going to consider too. How many people did you cause to stumble? And did something happen? Was I, God, able somehow through some instruments or whatever to straighten out these people before I had Christ return, so that we had a lot of them turn around and come into keeping one mind, one spirit, all teaching and believing the same thing? Monday is not the correct day to be keeping Pentecost. God showed that to Mr. Armstrong in 1974. Some rebelled and jerked out, and no! And some of those who rebelled and jerked out had actually gone to Mr. Armstrong 20 years before trying to convince Mr. Armstrong that Sunday should be the correct day of Pentecost. So that's kind of like, what's with these flippy people, And pardon me for being so blunt about it, those of you who may be related to him. But you need to recognize the truth, and those who fight the truth are doing evil. Not good, they're doing evil, and you need to repent of that. If you've fallen for the evil, no matter who got you into it, even if it was your dad, you need to repent of that evil. You still love your dad, and you still hope God will help him straighten out the evil he's done and bring him into the kingdom at some point, whether the first or second resurrection, and hopefully not the third. It's that serious, though, friends. And it could not only keep you out of God's kingdom, it could keep you out of something on the way to it that might be very important, that for some people may make the difference between going into God's kingdom or not, and that is being accounted worthy to escape the great tribulation to come. Some people are not strong enough to make it through the tribulation. I'm not sure I would be, so I am hoping and pitching on, God, you account me worthy to escape. Put me through the pressure cooker now. Prove me now and get me out of here when the tribulation comes, because you've offered that. Luke 21:36, God offers, if you watch and pray, that you may be accounted worthy to escape, is a promise he holds out in that same verse. He's telling you, do this and do that, and you will be accounted worthy to escape. Watch and pray always. And he told us in one place that means watch your conduct, but he told us more so in that chapter. He wants us watching the world events that relate to the first 4 seals, and then he says you can escape the 5th seal, which is, he says, what's coming. And that's what Mr. Armstrong said is the next major event in prophecy to be coming. The 5th seal, the Great Tribulation. And you can escape that. And you should want to escape that. That should be an intermediary goal, with your high goal being the first resurrection. Those are Mr. Armstrong's words, brethren. That's not me coming up with some opinion and idea that, this is an opinion and idea of Stephen Gilbreath. No, it's not. I am teaching as I was taught. And I got that from Mr. Armstrong. God gave it to us through him, the credit for that statement. goes to God first of all, and next it was given to us through Mr. Armstrong. And everybody else that mentions it should be teaching as we were taught, all speaking the same thing, having one mind of one spirit, one body. We're going to go to a comment Mr. Armstrong makes about what is the church in one body in a moment, and then we're going to go to Mr. Armstrong. It'll be a little bit longer Sabbath, just a little bit, and we'll be getting into Mr. Armstrong in a moment. But let me put another slide up that shows you another year, 1935. I ran out of time, brother, and I was late coming on as it was. I didn't get to look up the Passover date for 1935 and get it into my... Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry, I'm reading that wrong. That's my blank slide for 1936. I did find 1935. Excuse me. All right. 1935, Passover that year was April 17, a Wednesday. And then when you count from the Wave Sheaf Day, which is figured from the Sabbath in that week of April 17, you come out with Pentecost being on Sunday, June 16, which that year was 15 Sivan. So we've established that year, Sivan 6, was not a 50-day count from the weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. Are you with me? You got that? Sivan 6 in 1935 was not, as it is this year. This year, Sivan 6 happens to be 50 days from the Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread. So it just lined up. It did not line up in 1935 when Mrs. LeBleu, how do you say that in French? I had French class. It's been a long time. Le bleu. That's how you kind of say it. You had nasal it a little bit to do French.
We were taught that if you just squeeze your nose, you're halfway there with French.
I'm sorry. I hope I'm not offending any French brethren, but maybe you're not understanding English anyway. But anyhow, brethren, just having a little fun on Pentecost Day. Maybe too much fun. But Sivan 6 in 1935 was not 50 days from the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. And yet, that year, 1935, according to Mrs. LeBleu, the diary of Mrs. LeBleu, she and Loma Armstrong and Mr. Herbert Armstrong were keeping Pentecost on Sivan 6, which was a Friday that year. Not a Sunday, not a Monday. Those of you in Oregon who are still hard-headedly keeping a Monday Pentecost. That was not revealed knowledge, because initially Mr. Armstrong was keeping Pentecost on Sivan 6 every year, no matter what day it fell on. In 1935, it fell on a Friday. I just showed you on the earlier slide how in 1936 it fell on a Wednesday. And let me see, did I go to another year? Let's see. I didn't have time to look up 1934, but I did go back and take a look at 1927, the first year that Mr. Armstrong, with his wife Loma, alone, the two of them, kept the feast days. Now, he was baptized in late May or June. There's a question of whether he would have been keeping Pentecost that year. He may have started keeping the feast with the Feast of Tabernacle season, with Feast of Trumpets and Atonement, and Feast of Trumpets, Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles. But just for a point of reference, that year, 1927, Sivan 6 was on a Monday that year, and Passover was on April 16, a Saturday, a Sabbath, and you count from the Sabbath, weekly Sabbath you'd count for, that year you would have counted from, the Wave Sheaf would be the next day. Yeah, you'd count the 50 from the next day, including that day as number one, from Passover, April 16, and it comes out to be Sunday, June 5 that year, not Monday, Sivan 6. Now, there's no diary record or any record I've been able to find that says Mr. Armstrong kept Pentecost on any certain date in 1927. But based on the diary of Mrs. LeBleu, that shows in 1935 and 1936, Mr. Armstrong, Mrs. Armstrong, and Mrs. LeBleu, with them and other brethren too, were all keeping Pentecost on Sivan 6 in years when the count from the Sabbath, weekly Sabbath, within the days of unleavened bread would have put Pentecost on a day other than Sivan 6. Are we clear on that? Are you getting it, brethren? Did I fumble up my words so some of you missed it? Or do you was it kind of like, whoosh, that was a lot to try to absorb? Well, just go to the archive and back this tape up to where I started talking about it. Listen to it again. Look at these slides until it sinks in. Oh, in 1935 and 1936, Pentecost, counting at 50 days from the weekly Sabbath during days of unleavened bread, did not fall on the Sivan 6, and yet in those years, the diary of Mrs. LeBleu, who kept Pentecost with Mr. Armstrong and Mrs. Armstrong and the other 18 brethren of that early Philadelphia era, kept Pentecost on Sivan 6 instead. Duh. Okay, you got that? They didn't keep it on a Monday that counts from the weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread as revealed knowledge. Did not happen that way. That's a lie. Some of you who are now keeping Monday Pentecost have been told. You have accepted it blindly without researching the facts that are available to you. And go contact the daughter-in-law, Mrs. LeBleu. I just wrote her and asked her, Jan Gale Cole LeBleu, to try to get her hands on and protect that diary. And I think above any people on the face of this earth, her daughter-in-law, because of her faithfulness to Mrs. LeBleu during her latter years, would be the one entitled to have her possession of that diary. She's a relative and in the church. And she attended Imperial High School in a year I was teaching ballroom dance class to the juniors and seniors that year, and she was my assistant to help me with that, one of my assistants to help me with that class. And she did a wonderful job in helping me keep those wild seniors and juniors in line, and including Ray Johnson's son, Jerry, who would do little funny things behind my back. I'd actually see him, but I never called him on it. I loved his dad and his mom. They were wonderful people, and their kid, Jerry, would be back there, razzing me, and doing things to show off to his little buddy guys in Imperial School. And he wrote me his sophomore year, the next year would have been his freshman year, over in Bricket Wood. And he said, Steve, I want to apologize to you, and I want to tell you what I was doing, and I really hope you'll forgive me. I was back there making fun of you, or not fun of you, because I was conducting that class professionally and I believe well. I got good reports on the way I conducted that class. But he said, I was razzing you back there. And he said, making fun with you and disrupting the class. And I wrote him back, and I said, Jerry, I actually saw you doing that. I said, but you didn't cause me any problem. I was still able to handle the class. I chose to ignore it because I loved your parents, and I understood, there's foolishness bound up in the heart of a kid. And I felt that it would do more harm to call you on it than it would be to just let it go. So I just let it go. I was still able to keep command of the class, and when I would look, he would straighten up, you see. So, but he thought I wasn't seeing him, and he thought when he straightened up that, he thought that I would think he had been just as straight as he was when I was looking, when I'd look away. Because, when you're demonstrating dancing steps to the fellows, you got to stand in front of them with your back to them. So here you got this guy behind you, acting crazy. And I'd turn around, and then he would straighten up. Well, I could see him out of my peripheral vision. So when he wrote me and told me he had done this, I was actually grateful that he did that and asked me to forgive him. And I said, hey, I forgave you a long time ago. I just chose to ignore it. I forgave you as we went. But I'm happy you wrote me and told me that. And in the same letter, he says, man, I really appreciate now what I was making fun of then. He says, because I was able at these dances to enjoy it much more than some of the fellows around me who didn't go to Imperial in Pasadena and didn't have a dance class like we were blessed to have, Steve, through you, that God provided us through you. And it made the formal dances at Bricket Wood much more enjoyable because of that. Well, Jerry, that thrilled me to hear you say that to me. I really did appreciate that, those kind words. And your acknowledgement that your goofiness in the class, you're sorry you did that, and you actually do appreciate the class. So it works. Things work, And but Mrs. LeBleu, but Jan helped me. I would often demonstrate the steps with Jan, and she's the daughter-in-law of Mrs. LeBleu. Jan also went on to Bricket Wood. She was a freshman at Bricket Wood the same time Jerry Johnson was that year. But Mrs. LeBleu died this past week. Our condolences to Jan, who took this picture of Mrs. LeBleu just a few days before she died. Jan took this picture on or about May 15 this year, just a week ago. They're in Oregon, of the lady I've been mentioning to you, who has the diary that showed she and 18 other Philadelphia-era members kept the feast between her diary starts in 1935, so she kept the feast with those other brethren and Mr. Armstrong and Mrs. Loma Armstrong at least in 1935, 1936, until her diary goes through about 1939, when they switched over, either in 37 or 39, to keeping a Monday Pentecost then. And but in 35 and 36, her diary, Mrs. Lorinda, they call her Lindy, LeBleu, her diary shows that they were keeping Pentecost on Sivan 6, regardless, and in spite of the fact that in those 2 years, 1935 and 1936, Pentecost would have fallen on a different date each year other than Sivan 6. So they were just keeping it by the calendar, by the rabbinical priesthood instructions in 35 and 36, and not on a Sunday nor a Monday, because as I showed you on the slide, for those 2 years, in each year, 35 and 36, Pentecost was not on a Sunday, was not on a Monday either. So, and Mrs. LeBleu lived from 1913 to 2015, just died a few days ago, this past week. And her diary is a treasure. And it also shows something that some of us were saying. Brethren, you've probably heard me say a few times. You've heard me say a few times that the church kept Pentecost on Monday for 40 years before God inspired Mr. Armstrong and revealed that he should change it in 1974. Well, it wouldn't quite be 40 years. It'd only either be, if it started in 37, that would be 3 years short of 40. That'd be 37 years, or if in 39, that'd be 5 years short of 40 years. But for either 35 or 37 years, the church kept Pentecost on Monday. And in 1974, God revealed to Mr. Armstrong, the day after the seventh Sabbath is after the seventh Sabbath day, and that's a Sunday, not a Monday. So you don't add this extra day to it thing. You don't count it exclusive. You count it inclusive, with the wave sheaf day always numbered as number 1. All right, brother, I got one more slide before we go to Mr. Armstrong, and it's a slide that shows some comments by Mr. Armstrong from his autobiography, in which this relates to today. He said, the church, which I've often reminded you, as Mr. Armstrong said, is not a building. It's not an organization. As he says here in his autobiography, the church is merely the sum total of its members. Now, if we stop right there for just a moment with that statement, the church is merely the sum total of its members. What does that mean today? Brethren, when I was first called into God's church back beginning in 1967, when God began calling me, the question God put in my mind, I give God the credit for this because I don't know that I would have wanted this truth on my own, but regardless, this question was in my mind. I give God the credit and the thanks and appreciation for it, where I had just read Matthew 16:18 that says, I will build my church. So I said, well, wait a minute. If Christ builds his church, where is that church? And why are there so many church organizations, such as Baptist on one corner, right across the street, a Methodist, right across, catty-cornered from the intersection on that's a Presbyterian, down the way half a block's a huge, big Catholic church building, and then maybe some sprinkling in between those of a few other types of churches, all with a big steeple on top of them. And some not with a steeple. And why? And they all teach something a little different. My buddy I used to play ball with, we'd pitch every afternoon, but we wouldn't be able to go to church together because his mom and he went to a Presbyterian church right across the street from his home, which was down the way from my home, but we walked a block and a half further, or drove, in the family car, just a couple of blocks, to a Baptist church that my dad required us to go to. I couldn't go with my buddy to his Presbyterian church once in a while. My dad required us to go to the Baptist church. The Baptist church was the church to go to, was God's church, and not that Presbyterian church. Can't go over there. That's not God's church. Well, the Presbyterians saying the same thing to their members about the Baptist church. Hey, you can't go to that Baptist church. That's not God's church. This is about God's church over here where the Presbyterians are. And the Methodists saying the same thing, and Catholics and the rest of them. And Catholics making fun of the Protestants for keeping Sunday because it's not in the Bible. It's something the Catholic Church acknowledges, admits, brags of having instituted itself. Sunday keeping, Baal worship. That's of us, the Catholic Church. And you Protestant daughters, you are all following us if you hold your services on Sunday, because the Bible don't give you that at all. The Bible continues to thump keeping the Sabbath, which the Bible itself explains is the seventh day of the week, and the weekly cycle has not changed since creation. There's the first day, the second day, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then the Sabbath is the seventh day. And you can clearly see that on the calendar. It's Saturday. Even many languages acknowledge they still call the seventh day the Sabbath. They don't call it Saturday as many in the English language do. But brethren, just to cover, just before Mr. Armstrong comes on, just to cover something from his autobiography here further. So the church is merely a sum total of its members. Well, I did want to make this point. Some of you probably are thinking it. Hey, wait a minute. Well, we're scattered today. We used to be one great big body. And, hey, we could generically say we were members of the Worldwide Church of God, even though Mr. Armstrong said, brethren, none of you except 12 Board of Director members are members of the Worldwide Church of God. It's a non-member corporation. You are a member of the body of Christ, the Church of God, not the Worldwide Church of God, because it's a non-member corporation. All right, generically, it named what God called to be the Philadelphia era of God's church. So generically, yeah, we were members of God's church that's called the Worldwide Church of God in the Philadelphia. In the early part, the first 50 years and a little more of the Philadelphia era, until some perverts became in charge, and preverts and apostates, and tried to turn God's truth into a lie, flipped everything upside down, kwap, kaboom, and were the not the magnet, but the trigger for a great scattering, where some ministers decided to, hey, we're jumping out of here and we're going to take the opportunity to grab off a few church members, as many as we can, and form this little banana-peeling Church of God that we'll add an adjective to Church of God like Mr. Armstrong did with Worldwide, and we'll just make our own little thing. But, God says the church is the sum total of its members. And we're scattered all over with more than 600 different organizations. Brethren, is that of God's doing? It goes back to the same question Mr. Armstrong would ask in his broadcast that I was so relieved to hear when I was praying, God, show me, where's your church? And God opens up a broadcast to me, first time that I can recall ever hearing it, and Mr. Armstrong comes on and asks the very questions I was praying in prayer to know the answers for. Where's your church? Why all these different churches? And Mr. Armstrong started the broadcast with that question. I said, why, hey, there's the answer to my prayer coming. And was I relieved? And God brought me on into his church, for which I'm very thankful. And God says that church is merely the sum total. He says it to Mr. Armstrong. Autobiography, Volume 1. The church is merely the sum total of its members. So what does that mean today? Its members are all over the place. We're scattered, some attending this group organization, some attending that group organization. And all those group organizations, most of them won't have anything to do with the other one. And they want you over here where they are. Right? Let me be your minister, etc. Send me your tithes. Brethren, and now listen, here on COG TV, we have not started a group organization that you can join and become a member of and call yourself a member of this or that banana-peeling, blankety-blank Church of God. And I never ask anybody for tithes. Now, on a holy day, I do have to do what we're taught to do, what all the other ministers should be doing, actually. And if you're supporting a minister, and you've prayed and fasted about that, read the book called Ending Your Financial Worries, and done as it suggests, given the tests that need to be given, and prayer before God, maybe some fasting too, which I often recommend people do when you're considering, what should I do with my tithe? Well, take it to God in prayer and ask Him. And then when He reveals the answer to you, be faithful to it. But we have to go. We're told to teach as we were taught, and we're taught that on the holy days, you're to come before God not empty. And brethren, right after we covered this, we'll go to Mr. Armstrong. And so there's a couple of places we go. One is Leviticus 23, to look at the day that we're called together in a holy convocation. Today being Pentecost is one of them, a day that we count from the Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread. We actually count with the Wave Sheaf Day being day number 1. 7 weeks later, we number that day, which is after the morrow after the seventh Sabbath. We number that as number 50, and God calls that Pentecost in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus 23. And we'll find that in verse, well, let's start in verse 9 and cover the wave sheaf and all of that right there. And the eternal God, the Lord, spoke unto Moses, saying, verse 10, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest unto the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord. Now that day, wave sheaf happens during the days of unleavened bread that were approximately some 50 days ago. He shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And you shall offer that day, when you wave the sheaf, a lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto the Lord. So here we're told about an offering being made on that day. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deals. And at that time it was a very detailed, certain thing they do with fine flour and oil, an offering made by fire unto the Eternal for a sweet savor, meaning a gift you give cheerfully. And the drink offering thereof shall be of wine, the fourth part of a hin. And you shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that you bring an offering unto your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. And, verse 15, And you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought out the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete from that wave sheaf day. So the Sabbath that triggers the wave sheaf day is Sabbath 0. The 7 Sabbaths that have to be complete, which idiomatically does also mean, with understanding, 7 complete weeks from the wave sheaf day. So wave sheaf day, Sunday through Sabbath, that's 1 complete week. When 7 of those Sunday through Sabbaths have been completed, then the morrow after that 7th Sabbath, he's going to say here in verse 16, even unto the morrow after, did I read all of 15? It says 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. And then verse 16, even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. And the word Sabbath there is Shabbat, meaning literally a Sabbath day, but he's explained already that you're counting from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day the wave sheaf offering was brought. From the wave sheaf day until the end of the first Sabbath, that's your complete first Sabbath. And when 7 of those complete Sabbaths, meaning with idiomatic understanding, meaning 7 complete weeks, but then he says very literally, until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath day, at the end of that 7th week, from Sunday, the wave sheaf day, to Sabbath, 7 weeks past that wave sheaf day, at the end of that Sabbath, the morrow after that 7th Sabbath, shall you number, not count, but number as 50 days. Well, you do count it too. If you count, be sure to count the wave sheaf day as day number 1, because that wave sheaf day is part of the 50 days of Pentecost. But it's a 7-week thing, and after the 7 weeks are fully complete, after they've completed, then we fully come to the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. That's the 50th day, that's Pentecost. And then Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16. And many of you have heard this before and you know it, but you need to be reminded because you don't want to be caught short and not do what God said, to not come before Him. He wants you to bring an offering this day, and you got to do it according to His instruction. And if you're caught short, well, read quickly, ending your financial worries, and ask God to show you. God, where in the world do I put this holy day offering? You know, do I spend it on myself or send it to one of your ministers? What do I do? Do I give it to this group that's created a divided organization? What do I do? Ask God. Let Him reveal it to you. And if you need to, if you're not getting an answer, fast. And as you fast, watch for what God puts in between your earlobes, up here in your brain, where He says He puts His Holy Spirit here in this part of your brain. Ask Him, reveal through that Spirit. What should I do? I want to give this offering, and I want to give it cheerfully because I see the blessings You've given me this year, whatever they be. Good health, a roof over my head, blankets over my bed, food to eat every day. I got a book that I just sent to a friend who was having trouble thanking God. It's got 1,000 things you can thank God for in there. It lists 1,000 things separately. And there are details some of us may never have thought of. And like, if you're having a problem thanking God, go find yourself a book like that, or Google on internet for things that you can thank God for. Why, you could spend hours thanking God for this and that in your life. And, of course, one of the things we should thank God for is this wonderful calling He's given us to understand, first of all, that the annual holy days should be kept. That's one of the first truths that Mr. Armstrong proved about where is God's church, and he revealed it when he revealed it to the leaders of the Sardis-era church. They acknowledged that, yes, Mr. Armstrong, that's correct, but we can't teach our members this. They'll think that we were not the church, and it'll hurt us. So they rejected that truth. And then the second truth Mr. Armstrong brought to them, they rejected that as well, about the understanding to the key of prophecy, who and where are the sons of Israel today, which Mr. Armstrong wrote in detail to prove, and they, leaders of Sardis, acknowledged again. That's true, Mr. Armstrong, but we can't teach this to our members. So that church, which was accomplishing nothing, became dead. Now, they do thump pretty well. They got some offsprings that thump the value of keeping the weekly Sabbath, and some of those even say, well, you can keep the annual Sabbath if you want to, but you don't have to. So they lie to people, and they devaluate God's annual Sabbaths, which, with the weekly Sabbaths, they stand or fall together, as Mr. Armstrong proved from Colossians. And he proved they stand. He came home to his wife and said, honey, this Colossians thing proves we not only, looking up the original Greek word for it, as Mrs. Armstrong was encouraged her husband to do after she stayed up and prayed all night. That's what God put in her mind, to tell her husband, go look up that original Greek word, honey, and see what that does for you at the library. go spend the day at the library again. And he did. He came back and said, well, honey, it proved out. But we not only keep the weekly Sabbath, this proves out we got to keep the annual Sabbaths too. They stand together. So for those first 7 years, 1927 and 1933, they kept the feast together. And then beginning, probably they didn't keep Pentecost in 1927, so their seventh year of keeping Pentecost would have been in 1934. And then after 7 years of keeping them alone, in 1935, as Mrs. LeBleu, the diary of Mrs. LeBleu shows, that the Philadelphia-era 19-member church, initial Philadelphia-era church, kept those early feast days with Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong thereafter that. And they were keeping them on Savan 6. Incorrectly, until God revealed in 1974 it should be on Sunday. And a few years later, Mr. Armstrong began keeping it on Monday, counting it, but coming up on Monday, because of the word "from" being in Leviticus 23, verse 15, that should not be there. The translators added a preposition that's not in the original Hebrew. But here we are, verse, where were we? Deuteronomy 16, and I was going to, let me just pick up with verse 16. 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before the Eternal, the Lord your God, in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread. Now that place he shall choose may be a place that a minister God has led you to be supporting or following, and that's going to be between you and God as to what he reveals to you on that, brethren. And it's going to, he says, the 3 times are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's 1. In the Feast of Weeks, that's 2. That's this day, Pentecost. It's set off by itself. And in the Feast of Tabernacles, which includes Feast of Trumpets, Atonement, and Tabernacles. That's the 3rd occasion. The first occasion, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, includes the Passover, unleavened bread. And then the second one jumps ahead 50 days to Pentecost. The third one jumps into the fall season for trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. And they shall not appear, you shall not appear before the Eternal, the Lord your God, empty. Every man, verse 17, shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Eternal, the Lord your God, which he has given you. Brethren, that's all I'm going to say about it. Just remind you that God commands, instructs us to come before him this day and give cheerfully an offering according to your consideration, how you deem God has blessed you. And I'll guarantee you, from personal experience, he is going to respond in the days ahead to how you considered or deemed what he's given you in the days previous to this as a blessing. If you give him pocket change and you're saying, I only account these wonderful blessings you've given me worthy of some pocket change, God may say to you, well, okay then, this year I'll give you like you gave me. I'll give you some pocket change instead of all those big and wonderful blessings that you overlooked that I gave you this past year. And so you may find, oh, wow, my situation financially has changed all of a sudden this year. It's gone nosedive. So it's worthwhile, brethren, to consider what God says in his word. And then to be on your knees about where you should put his money and your cheerfully given offering. And if God leads you to do that here, I'll just tell you that you won't find it, but only on holy days, because we're not operating this for a profit-type organization or for seeking people's money, and we don't offer membership. But on the holy day, on our home page, you'll find that we've changed the support tab, which normally when you click on the support tab, it'll tell you how you can get an anointed cloth when you get sick and support from a ministry that God is using in a small way right now. But on the holy day, we change that tag. I just changed the word support to an S, tuck it over to the end so you get a separate page. And then we put HDO up there that stands for Holy Day Offering. And if you want to support this ministry, which is not a church you can join, and you don't become a member of a church group, we don't have one here. But if you want to support this ministry that we do that provides services on the Sabbath and the annual Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath and the annual Sabbath, and that does a nightly program of world news related to Bible and prophecy to help you more easily accomplish Luke 21:36 every day of watching what we should be watching so that you can get on your knees right after that broadcast and pray, hey, God, help those people that are suffering famine over here and that are suffering war over there and that are maybe suffering both because famine often follows war, as Mr. Armstrong would say, and that are suffering this trouble and this seismic condition and that seismic condition and this disease epidemic and that disease epidemic that is eventually going to kill 1/3 of the people of the United States, God says, the famine and the disease epidemic. The sword is going to kill another 1/3, and captivity is going to take the final 1/3 and leave just a small string, a few shreds of people alive into the world tomorrow. That's what's coming. You should know that from prophecy. All right. And I was saying, brother, we changed that tab that normally says support on the home page. You look for it across the top, the labels across the top on cogtv.org homepage. We changed it to say at the beginning of that little tab, it's about the fourth or fifth one over, to say HDO stands for Holy Day Offering. You can click on that. First of all, it'll give you an address where you can mail a check. You can make it out today, put it in the mail tomorrow, and that'll be considered your Holy Day Offering for today, Pentecost. Otherwise, if you do want to use a credit card securely and safely through PayPal, you don't have to join PayPal. You can still use a credit card, or you can use your PayPal membership and very easily get in there. You can click the button down below the address. It'll take you to a PayPal secure page. We never get your credit card information here. It just strictly goes through PayPal. And you can forward your Holy Day Offering to this ministry that way by credit card, or you can mail a check at the address you get under that same tab, that HDO tab on our homepage. You can get the address, mail a check, or you can click that button and use a credit card. And that button that's on that, it'll be a page after you click HDO. It'll show you address, and then down below that, it'll have a place where you can click to do a credit card. And then that next page is you're on PayPal, and you can easily do your credit card thing from there. Okay. All right. We covered Holy Day Offering. We covered some things about the details of how we get to this day, as how we count it as number 50, and why we should count it and wind up on this day, the first day of the week, as number 50 and not a Monday. Thank you, Mrs. LeBleu. And hopefully good old Mrs. LeBleu, who lived and died in Oregon. Hopefully, if some who understand this truth I'm telling you right now will share it boldly with the others. And even if you're a girl, be bold. Tell your mom and your sister and your husband and the other deacons, and if you got a minister in there anymore, tell them we're doing this wrong. And Mrs. LeBleu's diary proves it. Mr. Armstrong, from the beginning, was not keeping Monday Pentecost. That was not something God revealed to Mr. Armstrong. From the beginning, he was keeping Savan 6 for 6, 7, 8, 9 years, then switched to Monday. Then God corrected him and straightened us out, and we moved it over to where it should be, finally, in 1974, on a day after the 7th Sabbath day. Now, before we go to Mr. Armstrong, something else from his autobiography, friends, that you see on the bottom of this chart. I did a paragraph, and let's read that whole paragraph. The church is merely the sum total of its members. Unfortunately, we're scattered all over the place right now, but at some point, could be before, could be during or after, we're taken to a place of final training and safety, that we're all brought back together again. There won't be any church groups over there. You probably won't have money to deal with either, so the church groups won't care, because A lot of them are mainly in it. Well, send your tithe to us so we can do this work of God that God finished laying a foundation for through Mr. Armstrong. But he goes on to say, by the one Spirit of God, we are each baptized or put into the true church of God, 2 Corinthians 12:13. Jesus promised that when we receive the Holy Spirit, His Spirit shall guide us into all truth, not merely part of it, John 16, verse 13. And then I skipped a couple of paragraphs so that this would be readable on this slide. The last part reads, this is from Volume 1, so if you want to go read what is in between there, you can. But this was more pertinent for the point I wanted to make today, brethren, this latter part here. I know of no church or sect or denomination that had ever publicly confessed error or embraced new truth. Yet plainly, this would be a test of the true church. And right there in the autobiography, Mr. Armstrong went on and told how he did 2 tests upon the Sardis era church, which seemed to be, to him, it was the church closest to the truth that he could find. The first test was to write them about the annual holy days. And the leader of the church, of the publication, wrote him back and answered and said, "You're right, Mr. Armstrong, but we can't make that change or we'll blow the church apart." He wrote him a second letter a little later, said, "I'm going to give them a 2-part test now." That was the first part. They flunked that first part. Let's see how they do with the second part. And he wrote and told them about the modern-day tribes of Israel, Genesis 49, and how you can figure out where they migrated over to England, and then from England to the United States, Ephraim, Manasseh, and then the other parts of Europe where they migrated. You can trace those, and those all check out, as Genesis 49 shows, with the characteristics that Jacob told his sons what they'd be like in the latter days. This shows where those tribes are. The leader of that church, the Sardis era church in publication, wrote back and said, "Mr. Armstrong, that's true. You're right. But we can't teach that to this church. We'll blow it apart. Scare all our tithe payers away, the whole church fall apart." So Mr. Armstrong saw that, wow, that church is dead. And it was not willing to do what he said here in the last part of this slide, where he wrote in Volume 1 of the autobiography. A true church would be willing to change. He said, I don't, and so when he wrote this, the Sardis era was included when he said, "I know of no church or sect or denomination that has ever publicly confessed error or embraced new truth, yet plainly this would be a test of the true church." He wrote that back in 1927. Yet this would be a test of the true church. God allowed Mr. Armstrong to have that same test himself, so that when God revealed to Mr. Armstrong in 1974 that Pentecost should wind up on the first day of the week to be the morrow after a seventh Sabbath, literal Sabbath day, and Mr. Armstrong, after he talked to the Hebrew instructor over at the Hebrew University in Israel, and that instructor acknowledged to Mr. Armstrong, "That is correct, Mr. Armstrong. It has to wind up. It counts out to the first day of the week, not a Monday." So that confirmed what he had been hearing from others, and he held a 1-hour lecture as if it were a crow and explained, "Brethren, just like I said then, when we're in error, we don't hold to our tradition. We change." And he, in spite of the little bit of embarrassment it was for him, and I felt for him, I could feel him having to eat crow over for having taught for so long that Monday is a hallmark of God's church because we're the only ones that understand you should keep it on Monday. Then having to admit that, well, brethren, I made that mistake because of the word "from" being in verse 15 of Leviticus 23, which should not be there. And if it should have been there, then "from" would mean you count from the Wave Sheaf Day, exclusive, not inclusive. You wouldn't count the Wave Sheaf Day as number 1. You'd count the Monday after that as number 1, and you'd wind up with number 50 being on a Monday. As we kept it that way for more than 3 decades, almost 4 decades. And he said, brethren, once God showed me I was wrong about that, we've got to change. And so this year we'll be keeping Pentecost, as we correctly should count it, on Sunday. And brethren, that had been a prayer I had been earnestly, fervently praying that God would correct us about through his top leadership. And I didn't make any waves. I only spoke to one senior, making an inquiry as a freshman to a senior, saying, hey, why is it I seem to be misunderstanding this? It looks like it ought to be on Sunday, not Monday. The freshman said, the senior said to me, a freshman, Steve, I want to graduate this year. He says, Raymond Cole has already taken that to Mr. Armstrong 20 years ago and couldn't convince him, and we're still keeping it on Monday. And it was like, whether you think that's right or not, you must be wrong. We're keeping it on Monday. We're continuing to keep it on Monday. I didn't really get any answer from him that said, this is what Scripture says. In fact, he says, I want to graduate, Steve. And I took it, this is a hot potato. And somebody else has already been to Mr. Armstrong on this. And me, a freshman, I'm certainly not going to make any headway if I were to try to go to Mr. Armstrong, if I could, on it, as a freshman that year. I didn't. I took it to my knees, and I didn't talk to anybody else after I talked to that senior who I scared to death. I want to graduate, Steve. I'm a senior, and I want to graduate. And here we are. We're in the second semester. Second semester his senior year. He didn't want to be kicked out just before he graduates. So he was warning me this is a hot potato, too. An evangelist had already gone to him, Mr. Armstrong, 20 years ago, and that evangelist could not convince Mr. Armstrong it should be on Sunday instead of Monday. So I said, okay. So this is not new. And some evangelist has thought that, but the evangelist has either gone back to, okay, we should do it on Monday, or just left it alone, or whatever. But I still prayed, because as I would read it, I would say, I don't see how this could come out Monday. But I kept Monday with everybody else to be in obedience to the leadership, to be submissive to the leadership, which I knew God was working through, and through whom God had revealed all these wonderful truths to me. I didn't come up with these wonderful truths on my own. I got them from God through Mr. Herbert Armstrong, and I was thankful to God's servant for giving me these truths. And so we got a point off by a day for a while, and I would just take it to God and say, look, if I'm seeing what your word says correctly, will you please correct all of us through your leader? And if I'm not seeing it correctly, if somehow I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, even though when I read it, it causes my gut to say, we're doing this wrong. But if I'm reading this wrong in spite of my gut saying, we're not doing it the way you worded it here, then show me how I'm wrong and how I'm misreading what that says so plainly. It should be on the morrow after the seventh Sabbath day. And I looked up the original Hebrew and saw it meant Sabbath day. And so I said, you can't get Monday, 2 days from the Sabbath day, out of the morrow after the Sabbath. But I kept quiet. And I kept Sunday Pentecost, for my conscience sake, by myself alone. My first year and a half I was working in television. My third year, junior year at college, I was teaching at Imperial Schools. We only taught Monday through Friday. I had no problem with a boss over me or having to make waves with somebody in the church by trying to tell them, I got to keep Pentecost on Sunday, and then them going to, the ministry and saying, we got a kook here, and me getting thrown out, lose my job, lose my college, as a student, and be thrown out. So I kept my mouth. I didn't have to tell anybody, and I kept my mouth shut. I just kept Sunday by myself for 3 years, and kept praying earnestly and fervently, God, if I'm wrong, show me how I'm wrong, and if your word is right the way I'm reading it, show all of us through your leader decently and orderly. Some didn't want to do it decently and orderly, and they got themselves in trouble. Some didn't want to do it at all. Some rebelled and said, we're not going to change from Monday. God revealed that to Mr. Armstrong, which to me is craziest logic I've ever heard. Logic is not logic at all. It's emotionally insane to acknowledge God revealed something to Mr. Armstrong, but now that servant of Mr. Armstrong is making an error by trying to change it. That's the craziest, most lunatic reasoning I've ever heard. Those of you continuing to keep Monday, you're following the reasoning of a lunatic, a moony, insane reasoning, a reasoning which of a mind at one time which believed it should be Sunday and tried to convince Mr. Armstrong, and when it couldn't convince Mr. Armstrong, then for whatever reason decided to buy, okay, this was revealed to Mr. Armstrong, it should be Monday to make us some kind of very exclusive little sect. And so we're hanging on to Monday, and he's wrong for trying to change it, because God revealed that to him from the beginning. No, he didn't. From the beginning, Mr. Armstrong was keeping Pentecost on Savant 6 for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, whatever. As the diary of Mrs. LeBleu clearly shows. Jan, I hope you'll grab that diary. Hang on to it. Brethren, now, I'm going to make part 2 of today's talk, except for in the certain live stream archive. Otherwise, on YouTube, I'm going to make part 2 be Mr. Armstrong for today, giving a sermon that he gave, let's see if I can read that from here, back in 1981 on October 17, on Pentecost Day, back then, a sermon he entitled, Why the Church? So those of you watching on the archive, if you'll go to part 2 for today's date, we'll pick up with the sermon from Mr. Armstrong. Thank you for joining me today on Pentecost. This sermon that we're going to in part 2 is a sermon Mr. Armstrong gave on Pentecost, 1981, and it includes scriptures on the screen to make it a little easier for you and to have some visual value to it. So, but thank you, brethren, for joining me here on Pentecost 2015, and we won't do a nightcast news broadcast tonight at the end of Pentecost, because I don't want to go through the work on Pentecost Day, that servile type work, which I feel would be wrong. It's a day to rejoice, fellowship, etc. But Monday night, we'll be back on Nightcast with our regular daily current world news related to the Bible and prophecy, and then we'll be back here next regular weekly Sabbath, God willing. Okay, thanks for joining me. I'm going to sign us off for this Pentecost, for this part 1 of today's sermon. And those of you watching live, you don't need to go anywhere. I'm not going to cut it off. We'll just roll right into Mr. Armstrong. But for the rest of you from the archive, thanks for joining me. So long for now. For the rest of today's sermon, please go to part 2.